What's the best intake manifold for your cathedral port LS? Is it a stock one? Is it this high-ram? Is it something else? We've got an intake test coming up on 20 different intakes right now. First question anybody has is, how did an intake test of this magnitude actually come to be? And it all came from me opening my big mouth. I remember talking to the guys from Hot Rod saying, you know, why do we test just 1 or 2 intakes? Why don't we test them all? And they said, that's a great idea. Go make that happen. I'm like, dang it. I had to open my big mouth. And I apologize for the beeping in the background. Really? Come on, dude. You can't disable a backup beeper? We got to listen to that all day? Come on, be a man. Anyway, this test happened. I opened my big mouth, but we did make it happen. It was a lot of work, a lot more work than people realize. It's easy bolting the intake manifolds on. It's actually easy doing the tuning and testing, but there are a lot of things that go into this. There's a lot of different injectors, different fuel rails, different throttle bodies. So it's a ton of stuff, but guess what? It's all for the best because there's a ton of information here. And I realized back when I ran this test that there's a lot more intakes out now that I didn't test. But looking at the data from what I did test, you should be able to get a pretty good idea. If it's a short runner manifold like the new Brian Tooley Racing stuff or the Super Victor, you should get a pretty good idea because those are designed for high RPM. If it's a long runner manifold like the Fast and stuff, you should get a pretty good idea also from what's there. So we got some good shootouts. We got the Fast versus the MSD, we got the high ram versus the Pro Flow, we got single plane versus dual plane if you like carbureted stuff. We've got all the factory intakes, lots of good stuff, so let's get going. To get things started with our giant cathedral port LS intake test, where we tested 20 different intake manifolds, I needed a test motor. And a lot of guys ask, why didn't you use a stock 4.8 or 5.3 like we get from the wrecking yard? And the reason for that is because the power gains that you get from any intake manifold swap are in direct proportion to the motor that you tested on. So we wanted to show the differences, the power gains offered by these manifolds on a good combination. If you ran the same test on a stock 4.8, the differences in power would be much less. The gains that you would get would be less. In fact, if you have a stock 4.8 or 5.3 from the wrecking yard and you want to know what manifold to put on it, you should keep the factory truck manifold on it because it works really well. Now, a Trailblazer SS is a minor upgrade, but the intake is worth less power if you don't have a camshaft or ported heads, which this particular motor did. It was a 6-liter with forged internals from CP and Carrillo, good stuff there. We also had a set of AFR 230 heads on it, good ported heads, and that allow and a healthy comp cam too. We had the cam that I like to use for a lot of this stuff is a 54 469-11, and I'll go ahead and put the specs up here, but it's a 231 247 cam, and it works really well, makes a lot of power. As we'll see with some of these intakes, it was up near 600 horsepower. So this is a good combination, and it really shows what the manifolds do. And that's what we wanted to do. But we started off with the least powerful of all the factory cathedral port intakes, and that's the LS1 intake. So equipped with the LS1 intake, and actually we had long tube headers and we had the Holley EFI HP management system on it, and everything was tuned so that we maximized the power output, but they all came out to be about the same in terms of air fuel, 12.9 or so. So this was the factory LS1 manifold. Our 6-liter produced 535 horsepower and 468 foot-pounds of torque. Now the other thing we did was we made sure to put the correct size throttle body on each of the intakes based on whatever the throttle opening was on the manifold, because it doesn't make any sense to put a 78mm throttle body on a 102mm throttle opening, or vice versa, because the big throttle body does nothing when the throttle opening in the manifold is already sized for a particular throttle body. So this is the LS1. So the first, and we'll run through a group of the factory intakes first. So the first one up, in comparison to this LS1, is the factory truck manifold. So this is the early truck. Same thing you'll find on an LR4 or an LM7 truck motor, or even an LQ4 6-liter. So the early truck manifold is a bit better than the LS1, which is why it's so popular for a lot of stuff. It comes with the motor that you get from the wrecking yard, which is good because it's free, and it's very effective. So equipped with the truck manifold, we made 549 horsepower. Torque was up to 481 foot-pounds, and as you can see, there were gains throughout the whole curve, which is why we're going over this in graph form, because it doesn't make any sense for me just to tell you peak power numbers. So now let's take a look at the LS6 intake. So as you can see, not a lot of difference between the LS6 and the truck manifold, just a little bit there at the top, and a little bit of a loss down low. So on this kind of application, the early truck manifold works really good. The LS6 does make a little bit more power, and if we revved it farther than that, the LS6 probably would come into its own. Now finally, the Trailblazer SS, which is the best factory cathedral port manifold that they made. And as you can see here, it picked up power everywhere compared to the early truck and the LS6. So equipped with the LS6, I didn't give you the peak numbers, it produced 557 horsepower. But with the Trailblazer SS, it was up to 562, and peak torque was all the way up to 496.6, so we can round that up and say 497 foot-pounds. So here are all the factory ones. If you're wondering about an LS2, I didn't have an LS2, but an LS2 will typically make more or less than an LS6, even with the bigger throttle opening. In all of my testing comparing those two, the LS2 is not quite as good. So here are all the factory intakes. Now let's start looking at the aftermarket ones. After running our tests on the factory intakes, we stepped up to what I've grouped together as the aluminum intakes that appear like the factory ones. It means they're all long runner. They're all designed for fitment, just like an LS1 or LS2 or LS6. So this is our factory LS1 intake, which we're going to compare all the manifolds to. And we'll kind of compare them in these groups as well. So the first intake that we tested was from BBK. And as you can see, the BBK offered some good gains over the factory LS1. 568 horsepower, and torque was up to 487 foot-pounds of torque, so the torque number was good. And actually 488 or 489 foot-pounds, that's good. So as you can see, the gains were, it offered gains throughout the entire RPM range, which is always good, and they get greater with RPM, which is kind of typical. So now let's take a look at one of the other similar style manifolds, aluminum version of these long runner ones. This one was from Speedmaster. Not quite as good a gains as the BBK, definitely better than the LS1. So equipped with the Speedmaster piece, produced 561 horsepower and 478 foot-pounds of torque. So the final one in this group was the Wyand intake. This was an old, I think it was a Lingenfelter Signature Series deal too. And by the way, shout out to the late John Lingenfelter, awesome guy. I got to meet him a couple of times and he was nothing but fantastic. So the Wyand intake, very comparable to the BBK, slightly less at the very top up here in this range. Kind of mirrored a little bit better than the BBK down low. So equipped with that Wyand intake, 566 horsepower, and similar torque, 487 foot-pounds. So in this group, these guys all did well. The BBK looks like it's kind of the best of this group. So if you're shopping for these kinds of manifolds. The other thing to think about is these are all aluminum manifolds, so guys talk about heat soak with these aluminum manifolds, and I'll be showing you a test later on heat soak and why the air moves by the manifold so fast that there's actually not time for it to grab temperature away from the manifold. So it'll be an interesting comparison. But in this test, all of these aluminum long runner manifolds, here's how they did. Now let's take a look at some shorter runners. After running the aluminum manifolds, it's time to get to what are probably the most effective manifolds available for this RPM range. And this is important to note that intake manifolds are RPM specific. They don't have anything to do with NA or boost. They're all RPM. So as we'll see in this group, these manifolds work very well in this RPM range. And they work very well in this RPM range under boost. A short runner manifold does not make a better turbo manifold. It only makes a better turbo high RPM manifold. So please understand that, because I know that what's going to happen when I post this test is everyone's going to say, yeah, now you need to do this under boost. Just move the numbers over on the side, and that will be what happens under boost. All of these manifolds operate exactly the same way with pressure. If you have a constant 10 pounds of pressure and add that to any of these manifolds, the shape of the curve will be exactly the same. Which one makes more power will be exactly the same. None of that will change under boost. So this is our factory LS1 manifold. Now let's install the OG original fast intake with that 80 millimeter throttle opening on it. You can see the fast, that early fast made real good power, and we just happen to have this laying around. That's why I tested at Westtech. I don't even know if they offer that anymore. But on our combination, it made 571 horsepower and 490 foot-pounds of torque. So this one actually did pretty well. And in all of our testing way back in the day when I was running all the LS1 stuff, this was always the go-to manifold, and it's better than the factory LS6, but it's not better than the new 102 LSXR version. So here's the 102 LSXR version. You can see basically better everywhere. They did a real good job when they redesigned that manifold. With the LSXR 102 manifold, it made 591 horsepower and I take that back. Torque peak is way out here. 505 foot-pounds of torque. So that's a pretty stout combination. And as we'll see, that's going to be very difficult for other combinations to beat. But Fast offers two versions of this. So we tested the LSXR and the LSXRT. And it's important to note before I show you the dyno results here, the LSXRT, people think that the T stands for truck, and maybe that's what they originally wanted people to think. But it's not a truck manifold. It's not a truck manifold in the sense that it makes more power down low, because as we'll see, it basically makes exactly the same power as the LSXR. And I've tested this manifold, I don't know, 15 times probably, and we always compare it to the LSXR, and it's always a toss-up. They basically make the same power. They make the same curve. There might be minor differences in various spots in the curve, but this is what they do. So the LSXR and the LSXRT are basically the same thing. The LSXR seems to fit better. With the LSXRT, we made 592 horsepower. Torque was down 1 or 2 foot-pounds. 502 foot-pounds. So basically they're the same. So these are good combinations, especially for this RPM range. You won't find something to beat this, although here I want to show you the final one in this group, which also does very well, and that is the MSD Atomic intake. So we're getting a little busy here, so what I want to do is I'm going to get rid of the OG Fast. I'm going to get rid of the LSXRT. So now we can kind of see the blue is the stock LS1, obviously. The green is the LSXR, and the red is the MSD. Now the red MSD, 592 horsepower, so very comparable to the Fast. But the interesting thing is, if you look at this sine wave that's happening in here on the red, it's kind of going up and down. So the Fast made a little bit more torque and power through a lot of the RPM range, and then they kind of converged and made the same at the top. So if you guys have tested it, let me know in the comments if you guys have run an actual comparison between these two, because I've done this several times, and this is kind of what I see, that I'll bet that this is runner length, because when I see sine waves like that, it's usually a change in runner length between the Fast and the MSD. I'd like to go in and maybe measure those and find out what's going on. But this is what happened on our 6-liter, so now let's get to the rest of the manifold. After running the Fast and the MSD manifold, it was time to run some short runner stuff. And as we'll see, short runner has a decided effect on the shape of the power curve. So this was our LS1. And the first one up was actually the Holley mid-rise manifold. And there's a lot of confusion about this manifold because they think that the mid-rise makes a ton more torque than the high ram, as we'll see. Something different going on there. This is the mid-rise, and the mid-rise is a convertible manifold, I like to say, because you can run it in a bunch of different configurations, like the high ram with a bunch of different lids on it. And in case of that mid-rise, you can run it as a dual quad manifold, which I will when we run the carbureted stuff. You could run it as a dual quad with throttle bodies. You can also run it with the upper section attached to it and have the normal snout with a single throttle body, which is the way that we ran this. But equipped with that mid-rise, our 6-liter produced 566 horsepower. But you can see the torque was actually down a little bit compared to even the factory LS1 manifold down low. So that was an interesting combination. Now let's take a look at the shiny fabricated intake that everybody likes to run and everybody asks questions about online. This one was... I'm going to get rid of the dual quad here. So this short runner manifold, this fabricated one, now Holley offers them as snipers, and you know, they look really nice. They're all polished up and they look fancy, and they fit under the hood, which is nice because they've got short runners. But as you can see, the short runners make less power down low. In fact, it made less power from, oddly enough, the crossover point between horsepower and torque at 5252. Made less power down low, did offer big power gains as we go up. But these manifolds, and incidentally, this short runner manifold made 587 horsepower, but it would want to keep running past 7,000 RPM. So if you're running something that's 7,500 or even 8,000, these short runners become a much better deal, even under boost, because this same thing happens under boost. So if you were to add boost to this, it would make less power than the factory manifold all the way up until 5252, and then it would start making more. So if you're only revving past 5,500 RPM, let's say, and you're doing that on a drag strip, then this could become beneficial. Otherwise, maybe not a good trade-off for like a typical street car, unless guys choose that just because it looks cool, and there's no problem with that either. Now let's take a look at the heavy hitters, I think, in this combination. That would be the Edelbrock Pro Flow. So as you can see, the Pro Flow, similar thing to this short runner sniper type short runner fabricated manifold. Lost power down low, although the trade-off on the Pro Flow was earlier, you know, better than that short runner fabricated manifold, and it made a little more peak power, 593 horsepower, and made more power from 5,000 all the way up to 7,000. Although it looks like here at the end, maybe the short runner sniper style deal was may have caught it and passed it. We don't know because we didn't rev it that high. But this Pro Flow is very popular for high RPM turbo applications. A lot of guys using it on 8,000 RPM, you know, 5.3 turbo combos, and it works really well. I'm going to get rid of that fabricated manifold because everybody's going to want to know how the high ram does against the Pro Flow, because they're obviously mortal enemies, so we can find out how they did. So here's the high ram, and we set the high ram up with the lid on it with a single throttle opening like most people run them. But as you can see, the high ram and the Pro Flow were virtually identical. Technically speaking, the high ram made 1 or 2 horsepower more at the peak. It made 597. In fact, it made the most peak power of any of these 20 different intake configurations that we ran. But, I mean, and here's an interesting point I wanted to show. If we compare those to a fast LSXR, which now the Holley high ram and the Pro Flow both make more peak power than the fast did. But look at the power curve, you know, basically below 6,400 RPM. I mean, even from 7,000 on down, the long runner stuff in this RPM range is definitely a better way to go. Even though the others make 2 or 3 or 4 or even 5 more peak horsepower. And that's why I don't talk to people about peak numbers, unless you wanted to talk about peak torque. Then there would be a big change. But this goes to show you, runner length is the key to this thing. And if you want to run a motor at 7,000 or lower, you want long runner length. And this becomes even more important if the displacement on the motor is reduced. So if we weren't running this on a high horsepower 6-liter and we were doing it on a 5.3, you definitely would want longer runner length. So now let's take a look at some of our carbureted intakes. After running all these fuel injected combinations, obviously we had to give the carbureted guys some love. So we wanted to show you how they compare to this factory LS1 intake. So our first one was actually the Holley, we're calling it a dual quad. It's their mid-rise, but we ran it with a pair of 600 CFM carburetors on it. And as you can see, it kind of equaled the power output of the factory LS. So if you were putting together, you wanted to do an OG dual quad, small block out of the LS, and you wanted 2 carburetors on there, that dual quad manifold's a good combination, and it's going to do at least as good as the factory manifold does, and you should be able to drive around, have good power, and it looks cool. You can put a cool air cleaner on it and stuff. Now let's take a look at what happens. And I also ran this dual quad test with 2 4150 throttle bodies on it, and it basically did the same thing. So I just wanted to show you this curve and show you what was going on. So now let's take a look at the more traditional carbureted intakes, starting with a Performer RPM Edelbrock dual plane intake. And the dual plane intake was kind of cool because it shows you that what we've always talked about on carbureted manifolds on any kind of small block Ford or Chevy or Dodge or whatever, the dual plane stuff is always good for street use because it makes so much more low speed power than a single plane, and we'll see that. But even compared to the long runner LS1 intake, the dual plane actually made more torque down low, all the way up to 4,700 RPM. It kind of dipped below the factory LS1 out to about 6,000, and then actually made a little bit more peak power. 544 horsepower, and the peak torque actually occurred pretty early in the RPM range, so 470 foot-pounds of torque. So now let's take a look and see how that compares to a single plane carbureted manifold. And yes, by the way, I want you to make comments, but yes, we did adjust jetting and all that to make sure that this was right. So this is a Holley single plane. As a matter of fact, let's take a look at the Victor Jr. This is an Edelbrock Victor Jr. in the red, so it actually made less torque than the factory LS1 and a lot less than the the RPM dual plane through most of the curve, and then was a little better at the top. So equipped with the Victor Jr., it made 552 horsepower. So it was better than the factory manifold and better than the dual plane at the very top, basically from 6,000 on out. But through most of the curve, it was down quite a bit, and this is typical. This is typical single plane, dual plane, and obviously, compared to the factory LS1 as well. So let's get rid of those, and we got one final intake to run, and that's a single plane from Holley, so very similar to the Victor Jr. In fact, we'll compare that because those are kind of marketplace competitors. And the same thing with the single plane Holley. It made more peak power. It was up near 550 horsepower. Yeah, 549 horsepower. Peak torque occurred late in the RPM range, 466 foot-pounds. So let's see how this single plane Holley compared to the similar Victor Jr. intake. Actually, the Holley made more low-speed power than the Victor Jr. The Victor Jr. made a little bit more on the top, so they basically traded. So it depends on where you want your power output at, and what RPM range you want it at. The Holley single plane probably would be a little bit better as a driver, as a daily driver, and the Victor Jr. would make a little bit more on the top end. So maybe if you were racing and you wanted that. Here's how these combinations did. So let's get to our conclusion.
Okay guys, what did you think about our giant LS1 intake test? Actually, there's a lot of good data here, and I love doing this test. I love doing these giant things, and I got more stuff coming up. I've got the ultimate guide to cylinder heads for the LS. I tested all the cathedral port heads that we could get our hands on, all the rec ports, and a ton of LS7 stuff, and I tested them on different engine combinations. So that's going to be coming up. But I want to address the elephant in the room. Somebody please make the comment, okay, this is a cool test, but now do it under boost. Here's what happens under boost. Exactly the same thing. You see, intake manifolds are RPM specific. A long runner manifold like the Fast or MSD or any of the factory ones make good power in this RPM range because they're designed to do that. Short runner manifolds, Pro Flow, High Ram, Brian Tooley Racing, single plane, Super Victor stuff, that's all designed for higher RPM. So if you want to run those at higher RPM, they work well. If you want to run the long runner stuff at lower RPM, they work well. If you add boost to that, the same thing happens. They still are effective in the same RPM range. So if you want to run boost on a high RPM motor, short runner manifold. You want to run boost at less than 7,000 RPM, especially on a 5.3, because the displacement also has an effect. A long runner manifold is a much better choice on a smaller displacement. So again, boost, same. Intake manifolds work the same under boost. Long runners, good for low RPM. Short runners, good for high RPM. Enjoy. Thanks for watching.